Well, today we're reading the first chapter of Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians. And as far as an introduction goes, really not much has changed. It seems like Paul is still with Silas and Timothy there in Corinth during that 1.5 year period that he was working there. And Timothy, after bringing the first letter to the Thessalonians, maybe when he came back, he brought a report of what else was going on there. Or maybe there was some time in between. After Timothy got back, Paul heard a report somewhere else. And that's what spurred him on to write this letter. We don't know exactly what the timeline looked like between these two letters, but it seems like for the most part, things in the church are kind of the same in terms of when Paul writes this letter, he thanks them for their faith. Okay, he does talk about holiness, though not as explicitly or in the same way as he does in 1 Thessalonians, and he talks about the second coming. So thanksgiving, holiness, second coming, those are all three themes that also appear in this letter. And so that's just a good way to remember both of the Thessalonian letters: thankfulness, holiness, second coming. But there are some differences between this letter and the first letter. And the first difference is that it seems like the Thessalonians have actually grown in their faith and love. Paul actually says that in verse 3 of chapter 1, that they thank God because their faith is greatly enlarged and the love of each one of you toward one another grows ever greater. And that's amazing because that's exactly what Paul prayed for in the first letter. He told them, I'm praying that your love for one another would continue to abound. And that's exactly what is happening. Prayer is so powerful. And that's why in this letter, at the end of every chapter is a prayer. Now, at the end of every chapter in 1 Thessalonians, it was a mention of the second coming of Jesus. But here, Paul doesn't do that. Instead, he ends each chapter with a prayer. I mean, he's already seen how his prayers on their behalf are being answered. So why not continue to pray for them, continue to let them know that he's praying for them. Now, there is one major difference, and this is probably why Paul wrote this letter in the first place, because you might think, well, if the letters are basically the same, why in the world did he have to write it? Well, it's because in chapter 2 and verse 2, it looks like there's somebody who has come to the Thessalonian brethren, either with a letter pretending to be from Paul, or with some message claiming that the message is from Paul, or claiming to speak through the same Holy Spirit that Paul is speaking, saying that the day of the Lord has already happened. Now that sounds really weird to us, okay? But this was kind of something Paul had to deal with in his early work and even in his later work, actually. In 2 Timothy 2 and verse 18, there were some saying that the final resurrection in the end had already happened, had already taken place. And again, you just have to remember, they really struggled with this concept of a bodily resurrection, and their temptation was to just spiritualize everything. So it seems like somebody came along and said to them, look, Paul says actually everybody has already been resurrected spiritually. That's going to be resurrected. It's already happened. The day of the Lord has already come. And if you're the Christians, well, you're thinking, well, that's not good, because that means Jesus kind of left us here to suffer all this persecution that we're still facing. And he's allowing all these wicked people to just get away with their wickedness, and we're just stuck here. And so the people that were in the grave, like Jesus, he's already resurrected them, but then he left us. I mean, we were worried in the first letter that they were the ones in the grave, they were going to be left behind. But now you're saying that we've been left behind and all those in the grave have already gone up to be with Jesus. What in the world is happening? So this is why Paul writes this letter to say, no, the second coming hasn't happened yet. And especially in chapter 2, which we'll get into tomorrow, he's saying there are some things that have to happen first before the second coming happens. So don't pay attention to anybody who tries to disturb you by saying that it's already happened. And in chapter 3, we see that some of their idleness, some of their being a busybody and not really working, that's intensified for some reason. And we'll talk more about that as well. But overall, the same basic concepts of thankfulness, needing to be holy, ready for Jesus' second coming, are found in this letter that are found in the first letter. Well, let's get into chapter 1 now. And I know there's just not, I wish we had more time for introductory material, but we'll do the best we can here with chapter 1. Where Paul, first of all, thanks them. Again, he's not just thanking them, he's thanking God for them. I think that's a wonderful thing to tell your brothers and sisters. Not just to compliment them on their faith, but to also tell them, I thank God for you. And to tell them, I boast about you to other people. That's pretty cool. Paul actually says that he speaks proudly of you, verse 4, among the churches of God. because of your perseverance in your faith. How awesome is that? That Paul is going around to other churches and saying, look, you guys need to be like the Thessalonians because they're staying strong, even in persecution. That's a great compliment. And how awesome would it be for one of our brothers and sisters in Christ to come up and say, look, I've been telling people about what you did last week for the Lord, and I'm just so encouraged by your example that I'm just telling people about you. And I mean, maybe that would embarrass you a little bit, but it would still encourage you to know, wow, you're making an impact in somebody's life. Now, what's odd is, in verse 5, after talking about their suffering, he says this is a plain indication of God's righteous judgment. So there might be some thinking on the Thessalonians' part that, like, what is God's plan here? I mean, why in the world? We're trying to do what's right. We're trying to live righteous lives and we're suffering. How is that righteous on God's part? How is that good judgment on his part? Well, what Paul's trying to get them to see is actually it's perfect judgment on God's part, because Jesus showed us the path to glory is through suffering. And this is what God is doing with the Thessalonians. He's putting them on a path to glory, a path to being glorified with Jesus on that final day in his kingdom. But the only way to do that is to join with Jesus in suffering for righteousness' sake. But he does offer them comfort, because this has always been a classic problem for God's people, is why is it that the righteous are suffering and the wicked are prospering? Does God not care about his righteous people? Is God not going to do something about all of this evil in the world? And Paul says, actually, God is going to do something. He takes your persecution seriously. That not only will you be glorified with Jesus, rewarded with that eternal kingdom, but all those who are persecuting you will be punished. Jesus will carry out retribution when he comes with flaming fire with his angels, and they will experience eternal separation from the presence of God. So don't think for a moment that wicked people in this world are going to get away with it eternally. They might get away with a lot of things in this life, but they will not get away with their wickedness ultimately in the end, and especially not their wickedness of persecuting God's people. God takes that very seriously. I mean, it's just like a father or a mother and your kid is being bullied. I mean, when you find out about that, you just want to go find whoever that bully is, even if it's a little kid, and just wring his neck, right? Because you can't stand to see your child being mistreated. And God is the same way. He takes that very, very seriously. And so we should take comfort in knowing God has our back, okay? He is going to step in. He is going to do something about our suffering. It's just, we're going to have to wait on his timing. It's not going to happen on our schedule. And so we've got to patiently continue to hope and to live for Jesus. And remember I said, Paul doesn't really mention being holy specifically like he does in 1 Thessalonians, but the imagery and language he uses more in this letter is being glorified with Jesus. It's the idea of being magnified, that reaching the ultimate magnitude of your potential as a human being. And sometimes when Jesus showed us his glory, it was in the form of light, like on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he was just glowing and radiating glory. The glory and the weight and the magnitude of who he was just shining through. But then also he showed us God's glory in his character, in the way he loved other people. It was the way to show us the fullness of who he was. And the truth is, we won't be reaching that full potential of who we are, glorified as human beings made in God's image, until the second coming. And that's why there's language about the transformation and the glorification of our bodies on that day. Maybe that's why Paul is using that language, because they think the resurrection spiritually has already happened. But Paul's saying, no, we're not waiting for some spiritual resurrection. We're waiting for the ultimate glorification of our bodies with Jesus when he returns. And in the meantime, we can already show his glory in the world so that his name is glorified in us. And as we do that, as we share the glory of Jesus and show the glory of Jesus to the world by the way that we live and act, we are setting ourselves up for being glorified by Jesus in the end when he returns. That is the image that Paul wants us to keep in mind. That's the image he's using to encourage these Christians who are still suffering persecution. In fact, some think the persecution may have even gotten worse. And Paul's saying, you just continue to glorify Jesus, because when he comes back, he's going to glorify you. That is an amazing thing to think about and to place our hope in. And what we hope for is what we live for. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're covering 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 12. Now, when we read this section, our heads explode, and we think this is the hardest section in the entire Bible. But Paul ironically says this is basic stuff. This is stuff for new Christians. In fact, he says in verse 5 that I told you guys about these things while I was with you the first time. So hopefully, after this video, you'll see why Paul would view this as something so basic. He's fighting against the false teaching that the second coming has already arrived. And he's saying, look, two things have to happen before the second coming happens. Number one, there needs to be an apostasy, a falling away from the faith. And number two, the man of lawlessness needs to be revealed. And I don't necessarily think that that's like a 1-2 order thing. I think those two are kind of combined, happening around the same time. And what you need to see is that this idea of a ruler who exalts himself to the position of God, right, seats himself in the temple of God, okay, and persecutes God's people and deceives people with lies and false signs and wonders. This is a stock image in the Bible. This is a common motif that you see repeated all throughout history. In fact, we're studying the book of Exodus in our adult Bible class, and we talked about how foundational that book is to our understanding of the rest of the Bible. Well, this is an example, a perfect example of that point, because Pharaoh is the very first man of lawlessness. Pharaoh is the first example of a king who exalts himself to the position of God, right? He says, who is Yahweh that I should obey him? And he persecutes God's people. He tries to kill the male Israelites, and then he enslaves them. And he also deceives people with false signs and wonders. Remember, he had magicians, and they were able to duplicate some of the plagues because they were operating by the demonic power forces of Satan, okay? And so that image from Exodus, starting with Pharaoh, that gets picked up then in the prophets and applied to different kings throughout history. So for instance, Isaiah chapter 10 talks about the king of Assyria as boastful, this arrogant king who exalts himself to a position of God and says, I don't need God, and he persecutes God's people. In fact, he destroys the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. And then in Isaiah 14, he uses similar imagery of the king of Babylon. And he's arrogant and he exalts himself up to heaven. And he, of course, persecutes God's people. He even destroys God's temple in 586 BC. In Daniel chapter 11, he talks about a Syrian king named Antiochus Epiphanes. He doesn't mention him by name, but you do some study and some digging. He's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. He also exalts himself to the position of God. He desecrates the temple of the Jews in 167 BC. He persecutes many of the Jews, and because of his persecution, many of the Jews fall away from the faith. Now, the most important part here is Daniel chapter 7. Because in Daniel 7, he specifically says one day there's going to be a king of the nation of Rome. And that Roman king is going to persecute Christians. And when he persecutes Christians, he's going to exalt himself to the position of God. He's going to deceive people. He's going to act like he's God. Okay, but Jesus is ultimately going to win. This is really the imagery that Paul is getting at in 2 Thessalonians 2. Because he's writing in 51 AD. And by that point, Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 7 had not come true. There was not yet a Roman king who persecuted Christians. That would not happen until the Emperor Nero. This is where the question becomes, okay, who exactly is the man of lawlessness that Paul's talking about? Who is this king who exalts himself, sits in the temple of God, deceives people? Well, it starts on a small scale with the Emperor Nero in the year 64 AD. And I say small scale because he does persecute Christians, and it gets really bad, but he's only really persecuting Christians in Rome. And the Thessalonian brethren wouldn't have really felt that persecution. But around 90 AD, there's an emperor named Domitian. and he starts an empire-wide persecution of Christians. And even more significantly, before Domitian, the Roman emperors, they would not claim deity for themselves. They would only be ascribed deity after their death. So they would die, and then people would later, say that he was a god. But when Domitian started reigning, for the first time, that's when emperors started, while they were alive, to claim that they were gods. Okay, so here Domitian is a perfect fulfillment of what Paul's talking about with this man of lawlessness, because he exalts himself to the position of God. He seats himself in God's temple, kind of in a figurative way. I don't think he's literally going and sitting in the temple, but it's the idea that the temple is his house, right? He is the true God. He persecutes Christians, okay, and he deceives people. In fact, I believe this is what the book of Revelation was written to describe. The Emperor Domitian and his persecution against Christians. And he would use the emperor cult. And there was a cult that basically forced people to worship the emperor as God. And they were performing false signs and wonders to deceive people and to persecute Christians and to lead people away from the faith and in a great, apostasy. And the message of Revelation is, hey, stay faithful, right? Because Jesus is going to win. He's going to destroy the work of the man of lawlessness. Now, what Paul is telling the Thessalonians, though, is that the work of the man of lawlessness, even though he hasn't been revealed yet, it's already started. The deception, right, and the persecution has already started. The Thessalonians, they're already undergoing persecution. They're not undergoing persecution by the man of lawlessness, by a Roman emperor, because he's not been revealed yet. But already the work that he's coming to do is starting, and they're already getting a taste of it in the persecution there in Thessalonica. And they're getting a taste of the deception and the lies of the man of lawlessness. Because what's happening? In verse 2, there are people lying to them, deceiving them, saying that the second coming has already happened. This is what Jesus gets at. In Matthew chapter 24, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. And he says, even before that time, we're already starting to see Christians being persecuted. In fact, you go back and read Matthew 24, 10 through 13, and then verse 24, you'll see Jesus says, even before the destruction of Jerusalem, Christians will be persecuted. There will be Christians falling away from the faith. Many people's love will grow cold. He says in verse 24, there will be false Christs who are performing false signs and wonders, right? So all of that stuff that Daniel was prophesying about in Daniel 7, it was already happening in sort of an infant stage, right? In sort of a small scale level in Thessalonica. And also Jesus says that it'll already start in a small scale level around the world, even before Jerusalem falls. There will already be persecutions and there will already be false signs and wonders, okay? But it won't culminate until the ultimate man of lawlessness, probably Domitian, in Revelation. And Paul's saying, look, the second coming hasn't happened yet because Domitian hasn't come. Because that prophecy in Daniel 7 about Domitian coming and persecuting Christians, that hasn't happened yet. So the second coming hasn't happened yet. Now there's some questions like verse 6 where he says, you know what restrains him? We don't know exactly what that restraining force is. It's probably God, right? God makes it clear in Scripture. He has the ability to restrain Satan and to keep Satan from acting in certain ways at certain times. There's also some pictures like in Daniel of angels being in control of the affairs of different nations. And so maybe there's an angelic power from God holding this wicked king back from coming to wreak havoc in the world. But he says once that angel is removed, once God removes his restraining force, well then the man of lawlessness will be here. But the good news is Jesus will destroy him. Jesus will slay him with his word, right? With the breath of his mouth. It's the same picture going on in the book of Revelation where Christians win in the end. It's the same picture in Daniel 7. Christians win in the end because the Lord delivers his people and Christians will be with God in that beautiful eternal kingdom. That's the ultimate hope that we have. But in the meantime, Paul says, while you're waiting for the man of lawlessness to be revealed, understand his work has already started. The mystery of lawlessness has already started. So you're experiencing the persecution and the deception. And the key is to be a lover of the truth. He says, if you don't love truth, you're going to be swept away with the deception of this world and the work of the man of lawlessness in your society. And if you don't love truth and you actually are fine with being lied to, he says God will let you be lied to. He'll just send you a deluding spirit, let you believe whatever you want to believe, and ultimately you will be destroyed along with the man of lawlessness. This is so timeless for us because we might look and say, well, okay, if it was fulfilled in Domitian, well, then what's the point for us? The point is, that is a stock image. So even though for the Thessalonians, they were thinking about Domitian, okay, the truth is there were many kings and rulers after Domitian that did the same thing, that persecuted Christians, that, had ways of deceiving people with lies and leading people away from the faith. That has been going on since the dawn of time, right? All the way back to Pharaoh. And it's still going on really in every century. In different parts of the world, there will always be rulers who exalt themselves over God, persecute God's people, try to lie and deceive people into falling away from Jesus. And the point is, you stay faithful. You be a lover of truth. And that way, the man of lawlessness, wherever he is, in whatever context, in whatever part of history, he won't hold any sway over you. You will stand firm in the truth of Jesus. You will be victorious, especially when Jesus comes back in the end in judgment against all of his enemies and all of the men of lawlessnesses, if that's a word, that have ever lived for all time. I hope that's encouraging. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 13, on into chapter 3 and verse 5, and just grabbing something from yesterday's reading. I love how brilliant God is for using this idea of a ruler who exalts himself to being God and persecutes God's people and deceives people with lies and tries to get Christians to fall away. I love how God uses that as a stock image that repeats itself throughout history, because then it makes itself timeless in its application, even for people like us, this far removed from the letter of 2 Thessalonians. If you think about it, history really is always on repeat. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 talks about how there's just nothing new under the sun. There have always been rulers like this. In fact, even after Domitian, right? It may be that the Thessalonians were thinking of Domitian, maybe that's who Paul had in mind, but even after Domitian, there were more emperors who persecuted Christians and who exalted themselves to God and who spread lies and deception. I mean, Decius was one of them, Diocletian. Diocletian might have been even worse than Domitian. His persecution was called the Great Persecution. And if you just type in like a Google search for persecution of Christians throughout history, it's just amazing to see how many world governments and world powers and world leaders have in some way exalted themselves up to this arrogant position above God and persecuted God's people and spread lies and deception about them. That has happened throughout history. Look at Hitler. I mean, yes, he was against the Jews mainly, of course, but he was also against Christianity, and he was spreading lies about Christianity. He was spreading lies about what Jesus taught, saying that Jesus hated Jews. Look at Muslim countries today where their governments have absolutely no tolerance for Christianity. Look at North Korea, right? Kim Jong-un, okay? The guy is putting Christians in concentration camps even today, starving them, torturing them, beating them. Even the United States government, even though it hasn't risen to the point of persecuting Christians actively, you're already starting to see the spirit of the man of lawlessness working in the U.S. government as well with the lies and deception. Lying about Christians, painting Christianity as a religion of hate, and setting this idea of hate speech up, where if anybody speaks against anybody else's lifestyle, well then that's an act of violence, okay? And you can be put in prison for that eventually. That might be the road that we're heading down, okay? So we're already seeing those things happen even in our generation. So what Paul does is, and what God does is, he uses a stock image so that all of us will be able to apply what Paul's saying to our own lives. If he were to use a specific name and say Domitian here in chapter 2, or maybe some other Roman emperor or something, well then, what would we do with it, right? We say, well, okay, Domitian's come and gone, so what does this have to do with us anymore? And if God named some leader in the future, like in the year 2050 or something, well, then nobody would be living in readiness for the second coming, because we think, well, the second coming is not going to happen until, this named guy from the year 2050 shows up. And so, I guess the second coming is, not happening anytime soon. And even if you lived in like 2040 or something, well, then you'd still say, well, I got 10 more years before Jesus comes back. And so I'm just going to procrastinate and I'm going to cram at the last second when that man of lawlessness shows up. So God, he doesn't use specific names. He uses a stock image that can apply in every generation. And what that does is that creates Christians who are always living in a state of being ready for persecution to get worse. Always living in a state of realizing there could be another man of lawlessness right around the corner who persecutes Christians, who lies, right? And who exalts himself to God and tries to get Christians to fall away. But also, there's this dichotomy of like, okay, there could be a man of lawlessness around the corner, but you need to understand the spirit of that man of lawlessness that could be coming around the corner is already working right now. This is what Paul does in 2 Thessalonians 2. John does it as well. In John's letters, he'll say, you've heard that that the Antichrist is coming, right? So there's this figure that's coming in the future, and he's going to resist Christ and resist Christians and persecute people and lie and all that stuff. But then he also says the truth is many Antichrists are already in the world. And he says the spirit of the Antichrist is already working in the world. That's the same thing Paul does in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 from yesterday's reading. He says the man of lawlessness is coming, yes, but the spirit and the mystery of that lawlessness is already working so that Christians are already being persecuted. Christians are already being lied to and deceived by world powers. And that really opens up the million-dollar question. What do we do? Okay, what are we supposed to do when we're already experiencing and living in a time where the spirit of the man of lawlessness is persecuting us and deceiving us, trying to get us to fall away from the faith and go down the path of falsehood and abandon truth? That's what today's reading is about. It's about how to stand firm in times of persecution and deception. And Paul gives us some really comforting thoughts. Like, for instance, he says that we have been, in verse 13, chosen by God. He chose us from the beginning. We were that special to him, right? That he knew us long before we knew him. And we were so special that he chose us and made us his own people. He adopted us essentially into his family. That's amazingly comforting. Not only that, but he gives us a sense of purpose. He calls us so that he can sanctify us and make us holy by his Spirit. And so that the truth, that his truth would shape us into people who are more like Jesus, so that ultimately we would be ready, verse 14, to gain the glory of Jesus, to enter into that eternal glory, right? To achieve this maximum weight and magnitude of who we were always meant to be. And so it's like God has a plan for our lives. He chooses us from the beginning, and he knows our ending, where we're going to end up glorified with Jesus. He's pulling that language again from back in chapter 1, the idea of glorification, our glorified bodies in the resurrection. It's a tremendous hope that we have because of God's plan for us and God's choosing us. Also, verse 15, Paul says, I've given you truth. I've given you God's truth to stand firm in, to prevent yourself from being deceived. Remember in yesterday's reading, he warned about people who would not love the truth, and God would actually send a deluding influence and let them go into falsehood. Paul says there's a way to stay away from falsehood and to not be deluded, and that is to stand firm in God's truth. He said to love the truth in yesterday's reading. Today's reading, he's telling us what that truth is that we're supposed to love, and that's the apostolic teachings of Paul. Verse 16, we also have a God. He mentions that he loved us. Okay, that's a theme in today's reading. It mentions that in verse 16, that God loved us. Back in verse 13, it says that you are beloved by the Lord. In chapter 3 and verse 5, he says that he wants God to direct our hearts into the love of God. Okay, so the love of God is all throughout this. You are loved. You are accepted into God's family. You have a purpose. You have a calling. You have a future. Keep all of that in mind, and that will help you stay strong in persecution. Not only that, but in chapter 3, pray for preachers so that the truth of God will spread throughout the whole world. That's the best way to combat the deception of the man of lawlessness, is to spread the truth of God to as many places as possible. And the New American Standard says that the word of the Lord will spread rapidly. Literally, the word is run. So it's a picture of the gospel running from town to town as fast as it can. And the prayer is that people would receive it and glorify it and give it its full weight and magnitude that it deserves, so that people will be changed and transformed And he also says to pray that those preachers will be rescued from their persecutors. Okay? God is the one ultimately who will protect us. He is faithful to protect us from the evil one, from people trying to stop us from spreading the truth. And that's an amazing comfort. And then I love how comforting it is that Paul says we have confidence in the Lord concerning you. God has confidence in us that we can withstand the temptation of falling away in the midst of persecution, that we can stay strong. And we can hold fast to the truth despite all the deception and the hatred against Christians around us. God has a plan for us, and He knows that if we'll trust in Him, we can stay firm and we can enter that final glory. And when we do, that glory will all be worth it. I hope that's encouraging. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're finishing 2 Thessalonians. We'll be in chapter 3, verse 6 to the end of the letter. And Paul's using some pretty strong language here. In verse 6, he uses the word command. He used the word command in verse 4 from yesterday's reading. He uses it again in verse 12. And then in verse 14, he uses the word obey. So Paul, even though he mentioned in the first letter he was more like a father and a mother to them, here he's acting more like a general in the army, giving orders. And this is important because Paul, when he wrote, he wasn't just giving, tips and advice for better living. He was actually speaking by the authority of the Lord Jesus. And so some people think, well, we should follow Jesus, but Paul's writings aren't on the same level. That's just not true. Paul was actually writing by the authority of the Lord. And so when he speaks, we need to take him very seriously. When Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, he wasn't just talking about his own commandments that he was giving personally, but also the commandments he was giving through the apostles like Paul. So if we love Jesus, we'll keep Paul's commandments as well. He's also using strong military language here of giving orders and commands because in verse 6, the word unruly, where he talks about a brother who leads an unruly life, that's language about a soldier who's out of step and not following orders properly. Because there were still some, we don't really think it was all the Thessalonians because in large part the church is doing pretty well, but some of them are still not working. They're still being lazy, they're still being busybodies and idle and just getting involved in other people's affairs. And Paul is kind of tired of dealing with this because he says in verse 10, this was a problem when I was first with you. But then in 1 Thessalonians 4, he actually addressed it in that previous letter, and now it's still going on. So Paul's just, getting really serious about this, not only giving commands to those idle, lazy people, but also giving commands to the congregation about what to do about those idle, lazy people. Now, the question is, why were they being lazy and idle? Now, I mentioned in 1 Thessalonians 4, when we talked about this briefly, that probably part of it was that they thought the second coming was imminent. And so some of them were just kind of quitting their jobs and, what's the use of working if Jesus is coming back any day now? But I just want you to know that's probably not the core problem. That may have exacerbated the problem, but the problem was around long before that because, again, in verse 10, he says, this was a problem when I was first with you. So what was the problem? Well, we don't know exactly. I wish we had more detail about it. It could be that they were influenced some by the Greek thinking that manual labor was beneath them, and so they just need to, take it easy and live off the charity of others. And that may be what's going on there. But secondly, it could be that they're involved in the Roman patronage system. This was very common, where a rich person in Rome would like to do benevolent things. They want to become a benefactor because that improves their prestige and their reputation in society. And so a part of that is they would support various building projects in the cities around them. In fact, there's some of this mentioned in the Gospels where the centurion helped the Jews build the synagogue. It was the centurion who wanted Jesus to come save his servant's life. And the Jews said, hey, he's worthy because he helped us, build the synagogue. So that's very common. But one of the ways that they would exert their benefactorism or their benefaction, would be to help poorer people in lower social stratas and give them money and give them food. But in exchange, that poor person would become kind of like their personal secretary or their personal assistant to sort of run errands for them and take care of things. And it was kind of a dual purpose thing because they would both benefit the rich wealthy benefactor would get the benefit of the prestige of having more clients underneath him, more of these assistants underneath him, but the assistants also would gain financial help, help with food, help maybe moving up the social ladder a little bit because, hey, this guy is my benefactor and his reputation helps boost my reputation too. So it's sort of a scratch my back, I'll scratch yours sort of thing. But what was common is those clients really didn't have to work much. They didn't really have to do much work. They kind of followed the benefactor around and helped them with various things, but it wasn't really a lot of backbreaking labor, and so they didn't really have anything to do because the wealthy person was just taking care of them. That may have been what was going on, making them idle. Maybe that was also what Paul meant by meddling in the affairs of others. You need to mind and attend to your own business because these clients were essentially attending to the business of this patron and not minding their own business. The idea of being a busybody is also just sort of like busying around with things that just don't matter much. And yeah, a lot of those things that the wealthy patrons were doing with their clients, they just didn't really matter all that much. And so, yeah, maybe they're busy doing some things, but it's not really that important in the grand scheme of things. It's not really challenging them to work with their hands and earn an honest living. They're just sort of being mooches off these wealthy patrons. That could be what's going on. I wish we knew more about that. But Paul takes this very seriously, and he tells them to remember himself as an example. He said, look, when I was with you, I wasn't mooching off of anybody, right? I wasn't lazy, I wasn't idle, I was working with my own hands, laboring day and night so that I wouldn't be a burden to anybody. But you all think that it's okay for you to be eating and eating off of other people's generosity and charity, but you're not doing any work. So Paul says, if you're not willing to work, you're not willing to eat either. Now, this doesn't mean if somebody's down on their luck and they're just having a bad spell that, we just tell them, sorry, we're not going to help you because if you can't work, then you can't eat. Well, this isn't about people who can't work, okay? This is about people who won't work, who are unwilling to work because they're just being lazy. And Paul says, I don't want you supporting them, okay, and encouraging this sort of lifestyle. In fact, he says that you need to stay away from them. In verse 6, keep away from every brother who leads that kind of lifestyle. And then in verse 14, he says, take special note of them and do not associate with them so that they'll be put to shame. There's some sort of social and spiritual exclusion from fellowship. Because it's the idea, I don't think the point is Paul's saying, look, if you see them, you have to run away or something. No, he says they're actually still your brother. Don't treat them like an enemy. They're still your brother. You still love them. You want to help them. But you can't just continue to fellowship with them and worship with them like everything's just fine. You need to tell them, look, you're not welcome to worship with us, right? Until you straighten out your life and get your act together. Sometimes families do this, right? If one of their kids is just really acting up at the table and the kid is too old for a spanking or any sort of corporal punishment, right? Maybe the parents just say, look, until you can get your attitude under control, you go and sit in your room, okay? Because you're not going to have dinner with us at the family table and bring that bad attitude with you, okay? So the idea of that is not, well, my child is my enemy, I hate him, and I never want him to be at my dinner table again. No, the point is so that in his isolation, he'll think about what he's done and he'll be ashamed of his actions and then he'll want to come back. That's really the idea behind this social exclusion. It's not excommunication and we never want to see you again. No, it's, hey, we can't pretend like things are fine when they're not. When you're not living right according to Paul's commands, according to the way that Jesus wants us to live. And Paul, he finishes this letter by wishing that the God of peace, the Lord of peace would be with them. He prays for God's peace in their midst. He prays for God's presence. And ultimately, he finishes with praying for God's grace. Now, notice again, verse 17, he finishes with his own signature, right, handwriting. He's finishing this himself. And that's even more important, especially because in chapter 2, in verse 2, they apparently had received a letter as if from Paul. And Paul's saying, that's not going to happen. You'll know if you get a letter from me because you'll see my own personal distinguishing mark. There's lots to think about in this letter, and really, like 1 Thessalonians, the message is basically to stay holy so that you'll be ready for the second coming. But what you see is in this book, if we just want to summarize it, is that there are 3 barriers getting in our way of staying holy for the second coming. The first is persecution. He deals with that in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's false teachers. And in chapter 3, it's unruly Christians. And he gives the solution to how to handle all those things so that we can be ready for Jesus to come back, so that our bodies will be glorified with him in the end. Number 1, he says to deal with the persecution problem, hey, remember that when Jesus comes back, he's going to pour out vengeance on your enemies and glorify you with him. So stay faithful. And don't allow the persecution to cause you to fall away. For the false teachers, he says the solution is to be a lover of the truth and to stand firm in the traditions that Paul the Apostle had taught them. And then number 3, to deal with unruly Christians, number 1, make sure that you're not one of those unruly Christians. Make sure that you actually follow the commands, right, of the general, right, that you follow Jesus' commands through the apostles, and that you also put those unruly Christians to shame so that they will change and repent and stop holding the congregation back from being ready and holy. Those same 3 issues are things that we might face today, and the same solutions apply so that we all can be ready for that glorious day when Jesus returns. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're back in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 18. Remember, Paul is going to spend a year and a half in Corinth. That is when he wrote the letters of 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And now we pick up with him being brought before Gallio, the Roman proconsul, on false charges by the Jews. Now, gratefully, in verse 10 of chapter 18, Paul had actually been promised by Jesus, I will be with you and no harm will befall you in this city. And that is just so comforting, because anytime, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, you're standing before the authorities, if you get pulled over by a police officer or have to go to court for some reason, that can be a really scary situation. You have no idea what's going to happen, but Jesus follows through on his promise. He protects Paul from harm, and he also uses Gallio to allow Christianity to flourish in the Roman Empire. Gallio was proconsul from 51 to 52 AD, and he was very well known in the Roman Empire. We actually know some about him from an archaeological inscription that we found in the city of Delphi in Greece, where the Emperor Claudius mentions his good friend Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. And the fact that he was so well known in the Roman Empire means when he rules in favor of Christianity here, that's going to be huge for the flourishing of Christianity for years to come. If he were to rule against Paul and against Christians, oh boy, that would cause all kinds of problems, because as Christianity spread from city to city, the Jews could just bring Christians before the Roman tribunals and say, look, this is what Gallio said. Gallio was against Christianity. Christianity must be against the Roman Empire, and therefore we must shut it down. But God's providence, Jesus' providence is working here, and he protects Paul and he protects Christianity. He's brought before the judgment seat of Gallio. The judgment seat, also known as the Bema, you can actually find this today in the city of Corinth. You can find the Bema. It's a raised platform where Gallio would have sat in judgment against Paul in various cases in the agora or the marketplace. And interestingly, when Paul writes 2 Corinthians in chapter 5, later on, he'll say one day we're all going to stand before the Bema of Jesus. He's writing that to the Corinthians. They know exactly what he's talking about. One day we're going to stand trial before Jesus, who's going to judge us for the deeds that we have done. Well, the Jews are trying to bring up charges that this is an illegal religion. Religion could only be legal if Rome approved of it. And Rome had officially approved of Judaism as a legal religion. But the Jews are trying to say, look, Paul's not preaching Judaism. He's preaching outside of Judaism. And therefore, he's breaking our law. He's breaking Roman law. But Gallio's not having it. He sees this as just a Jewish dispute, that Paul's preaching some sort of variation on Judaism. And it's not really a violation of Roman law at all. And so he kind of wipes his hands of this and says, this isn't really my business. Now, the mob, unfortunately, is angry at this decision, and they beat Sosthenes, who was the leader of the synagogue. And, you know, sometimes that happens, right? If an official ruling doesn't come down the way the mob wants it to, then the mob's going to take things in their own hands. But Gallio still was like, This really isn't my fight. And again, we feel terrible for Sosthenes for having to go through that beating, but at the same time, this is just a huge monumental decision in favor of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Remember, Luke is writing Acts to show, in part, Christianity is not a threat to Rome. Well, Paul finishes up in Corinth. His year and a half is over, and now he goes down to Cenchrea, which is the port city there in Achaia, and he's going to go across to Ephesus. But before he does, he cuts his hair because he was making some sort of Jewish vow. We don't know the exact nature of the vow. Sometimes Jews would make a promise to God that they would do something or that they would thank him for something, and while they were fulfilling that vow, they'd let their hair grow out, and when the vow was complete, they would cut their hair. Paul is not doing this because the law of Moses is binding on him and he has to do this for salvation. No, he's doing it because he's a Jew. It's part of his ethnic heritage, his culture. He's not doing this for salvation. This is just what he would have done as a Jew, and not, again, sure what vow he made to God, maybe thanking God for his provision there in Corinth. Maybe his vow earlier was, I'm going to stay in Corinth even though it's really scary here, okay? And he completes that vow and cuts his hair. Well, he goes to Ephesus. He has a great reception there, but for some reason, he's not ready to stay. We don't know the reason, but he says, look, if God wills, I'll be back. And he is going to be back on his third missionary journey. He finishes his second journey in verse 22, and then in verse 23, he starts his third journey. There's really not much time spent here by Luke, maybe because Luke isn't so concerned in his narrative about Paul's work in some of these other cities. He really wants to get Paul to Ephesus because that's where he's going to spend 3 years, is in Ephesus. That's going to be a major part of Paul's ministry. That's where Luke wants him to get, and so he's not really spending much time on these other cities. But you can see from a map of Paul's third missionary journey that he's going back through the region of Galatia again to strengthen those churches. And remember, he was told no earlier, that he couldn't go into Asia. He couldn't go to Ephesus, but now it's a yes. And now he comes to Ephesus on his third missionary journey. That's where we'll be in tomorrow's reading in Acts 19. But before we get there, finishing up today, we learn about a man named Apollos. He comes from Alexandria, which is a city in Egypt. And those Alexandrian Jews were brilliant. These are smart people, highly educated. They had one of the most famous libraries in the ancient world. Actually, the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, was actually designed and compiled in Alexandria. Okay, so another thing that Luke shows us is that the gospel is for smart people. Okay, smart, intelligent, wise people also accept the gospel. It's not just for dummies. Okay, it's not just for commoners. It's for everybody at every level of intelligence. Well, he'd been instructed in the way of the Lord, and I wish we knew more about what that meant. You know, was Apollos just familiar with Jesus' teachings, kind of in a vague way, but not necessarily understanding, how salvation worked in Christ? It seems like he really understood how the Old Testament pointed to Jesus, and maybe he was influenced by John the Baptist's disciples. And so John's whole ministry was telling people about how great Jesus is. And Apollos, well, he picked up on that, right? He knew how great the Lord was, and he was going around telling everybody about the Lord, but he may not have understood all of the intricacies of what exactly Jesus came to do, what the cross was all about, what the resurrection was all about, and what baptism into Jesus was all about, because he was still just preaching John's baptism. We'll talk about this more tomorrow, but John's baptism was really just about repentance and changing and preparing their hearts for the Messiah. But baptism into Jesus, hey, that was about joining yourself to his death, burial, and resurrection. That was about receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit. Doesn't seem like Apollos fully understands all that. And Aquila and Priscilla, they actually are in Ephesus, and they see and hear him teaching something that is true, right? The things he was saying wasn't false, but it was incomplete. And it wasn't quite accurate, right? And they wanted to redirect him into a more accurate way. That's such an important lesson for us to learn, and it's going to help Apollos, because Apollos is going to then go over to Corinth. And now that Paul has left Corinth and he's going to be spending time in Ephesus, it's going to be so helpful to have Apollos go over in Corinth and teach them in Paul's absence, so that he'll be strengthening the brethren there in Corinth while Paul is away. And just some good lessons here. Number one, with our denominational friends, this may be something that we need to do. We need to take them aside and say, hey, let me show you a more accurate way. Let's study about this. It's not that they don't know the Lord. They know about Jesus. They know about what He's done, but there may be some things that they're missing. And the same thing is true of us, right? We need to be having the humility of Apollos to recognize, hey, we may need to be shown the more accurate way as well. And we need the humility to accept that instruction so that God can use us. Doctrine matters, right? Today we just say, you believe whatever you want to believe. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. That's not really how the Bible sees it. The Bible says, hey, there's an accurate way, and there's a less accurate way, and there's a completely false way. Okay, we want to make sure that we are being as accurate as possible in our Bible study so that we can be pleasing to the Lord, we can be strengthening other people, strengthening our brethren, serving in God's kingdom, like Apollos does. He will become a great asset in God's kingdom because of the work and the courage of Aquila and Priscilla to take him aside privately. They didn't embarrass him publicly, right? They took him aside privately and taught him. This shows us also women can teach men. Okay, it may not be publicly in the assembly and in a public official teaching role, but absolutely women can teach men about the gospel. This is what we're seeing here. I hope that that's helpful. I hope you have a great weekend. I know the videos this week were a lot longer. There was just so much more in these texts, and I'm going to really try to shorten the videos again next week, Lord willing. I'll see you then. Take care.